Do you know who the first non-native English speaker to host a primetime news program on British television is? Her name is Barbara Serra, and she kindly joined me on the Heroic English podcast for an episode you definitely don't want to miss. Barbara was born in Italy, raised in Denmark, and has been living in the UK for a long time. She has worked for the BBC, Sky News, Al Jazeera English and Channel 5 News. In this episode, we discuss her journey mastering English. She also shares her views on why clarity in communication is more important than having a perfect accent.
We talked a little bit earlier about the r, right? So there's three ways I can pronounce my name. One is Barbara Serra. One is Barbara Serra. And the other one is...
We also get a bit into the tension between opening up and adopting a new culture and expanding your identity versus retaining your own original roots. She's been there, done that, which, if you don't know, is an idiom that means she's experienced many of the situations you're probably currently facing as a learner trying to reach the higher levels of fluency. So I'll say that as you navigate your own personal English learning journey, Barbara is someone that you can learn a lot from. And on a more personal note, it was definitely an interesting experience to anticipate and have a chat with a person who's literally on TV, right? I think that was kind of interesting to see the person behind the persona, and Barbara talks about her television persona in this episode. So really grateful to Barbara for this insightful conversation. Be sure to check out her links down in the description of this podcast. And without any further ado, let's jump right in. All right, English hero, I'm here with Barbara Serra. Barbara, thank you for making time. I am so happy to have you on the show. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. Hi.
Excellent. So, Barbara, I've always been intrigued by the stories behind those who achieve great things in life. I'm curious about how they overcome obstacles, how they seize opportunities, and how they keep going to ultimately find success in their careers and lives. And, that's why I actually chose the adjective heroic for the name of this podcast, as I think it's a word that captures that adventurous spirit. That said, this isn't the heroic podcast. It's the Heroic English podcast. And, we focus on those who accomplish great things by becoming the most fluent, confident, and capable selves in English. In my eyes, Barbara, you're the quintessential English heroine. You've achieved the remarkable milestone of being the first non-native English speaker to present a primetime news program on British television. So, Barbara, I would love for you to, tell us, first of all, a little bit about your background. And secondly, what were the key moments and perhaps the obstacles that you encountered on your journey to this amazing achievement?
Definitely. And first of all, thank you. I think, English language heroine is a nice, it rings, it's a nice thing to hear because it has been a challenge. And before I start any of this, and now that people can hear me speak, I would just like to point out that the way that I speak now in English, and believe me, I make a lot of mistakes and I can often have bad English days, but it's certainly not the way I used to speak. And because I have chosen a profession, journalism, and especially broadcast journalism, where language is it's my skill, it's my tool, I always had to really sharpen my English. And, there isn't a single day, and there isn't a single program that I do or that I prepare for where I don't also work on my language, right? Where
Yeah.
before going there, I'm not going to do a few exercises, and it's so I just want to say it now because I think I am in that weird place where native speakers hear me and they go, well, she's not a native speaker. But sometimes second language English speakers listen to me and think, what is she going on about? She's a native
What's
speaker.
your secret? Yeah.
Well, a lot of time. So I'll just talk you through because, I think it was a journey that is probably shared by a lot of people listening. So I am of Italian heritage. I was born in Italy of Italian parents, and I lived there until I was 9. So until then, you know, Italian school, Italian at home, very little English, like, terrible primary school English. And I'm very old. So this is like the 1980s, right? So it was just very rudimentary English lessons. And then my family gets transferred to Copenhagen in Denmark from my father's work. And so at the age of 9, I go from a totally monolingual Italian life to an international school in Copenhagen. And not, the age of 9 is a very interesting age because I am not a linguist, by profession. Obviously, I'm not a speech therapist or any of that, but I've spoken to a lot in my time. And around 12, 13, 14 max is when language gets fixed. So if you learn a language before the ages of 12-ish, you will, you're much more adaptable. That's why children just absorb
Yes.
accent. After the age 12, 13, you become fixed. So, of course, you can still learn a language, but you will almost always have the imprint of whatever your native language was. So, anyway, so I moved to Denmark with my family, and I went to an international school where obviously, I mean, they called them international. It was all British and American teachers. The students were international. And there I have what I still remember. It's one of the most distinctive memories of my childhood was walking into this classroom and just not being able to understand anything. And if I'm honest, feeling very alienated. I wouldn't have used this word at the time, but now I would, a feeling very othered, not because people were being mean to me. It was school, and actually it was an international school. So half the kids there were second language English. But I just had this very clear memory of the enormous barrier that not speaking the dominant language creates. And of course, I'd never experienced that before because I'd always lived in Italy, where I just spoke the language. So, if I look back now, and sometimes it's like in life, it's easy to try to make things fit, you know, like a narrative that you create in your mind for other decisions that I've made in my career and my life. But if I'm honest, I do think that feeling of being different, of being alienated, of literally not being able to communicate, I think that's always stayed with me. And I like to think it's given me empathy and always an awareness of how there are different groups beyond the dominant group. Yeah. Anyway, so to go back to that, the way I learned English, again, I think those first months were key. So I'm guessing quite a few of you listeners may also have gone to international schools. Some classes you do with the rest of the class, but others that were very linguistic focused, like, I don't know, history or English, you get taken for one-on-one sessions with a teacher where they're teaching you the basics of English, right? For like the first year.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so, and the teacher that I got assigned to, was Canadian. And so I think that always left an imprint in my English, because my English, even to native speakers, sounds weird because it has a lot of different influences. I think there's a lot of Danish in it because I was surrounded by people who spoke English with a Danish accent because I grew up in Denmark. Then there was the Canadian imprint of my teacher. Then the fact I learned in an international school where everyone kind of spoke their own way. Bizarrely, I think the Italian has very little
Yeah.
in it
Okay.
because I never spoke English with Italians. I would speak Italian with Italians.
Yeah.
Um, and actually a lot of the weirdness, like I say, I think is more Danish. And so I think what it's left me with, and we'll talk later about what I think are the pitfalls of it, but what it left me with is very much an international English imprint. I
Yeah,
have lived in the UK for 30 years. Now, I've absorbed a lot of things, but I don't sound British. Believe me, I mean, certainly not to anybody who is British. And so I think that's the other thing that is happening. English is the international language. 1.5 billion people around the world speak English. 1 billion of them are like us, who speak it as a second language. And the truth is, we all speak it in different ways. You have listeners from around the world, well, people who learned English as a second language in, I don't know, Nairobi or Delhi or, Kuala Lumpur will all speak it with different inflections, right?
totally. Hmm.
Because we all bring I mean, again, the thing I always go on about is the R, the R sound,
Yeah.
which is very strong in Italian. It's
In
very strong in
Argentina,
Arabic.
it is as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I worked for Al Jazeera or Al Jazeera for many years. It's very strong in Arabic as well, and that to me is something. I mean, we can talk about it later, but things like that. We bring our mother tongues, we bring our cultures, we bring our different influences to the way that we speak English. And so whenever I see those courses that say try to sound like a British native speaker, I always think, well, why should we? Because that's not what we are.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is amazing. I love your backstory, and you said so many great things there I took note of. Even to this day, with your advanced level of English, near native or native like, I like if I didn't know this about you, your background, and the fact that you are known as the first not native English speaker to present a show or a news program on British television, I would say you were a native English speaker. But you still to this day work on those language things, right? You still work on that before a presentation, before you speak publicly, which puts things in perspective for a lot of learners. A lot of learners think that they struggle a lot, but we're all still working on our language skills and trying to bridge the gaps and things like that.
When you say that you're surprised that I still work on it, I think there's a lot of phrases that we use, like native speaker, second language, that in a way are a bit more complex. I think Italian is my mother tongue, but English has been my dominant language in a way from the age of 9, certainly from 18 when I moved to the UK. But even from the age of 9, because that was the language of school, increasingly that was the language of my friends. And then, that was the language of the music I would listen to and the books that I would read and the comics and the pop stars that I followed. My youth, that adolescence, those years of puberty, even though I wasn't living in the Anglophone world, were shaped by that. I loved American rock bands and British pop music because that's what I would absorb. And so it was always my dominant language. But I think there is a reality that all of us who are bilingual or trilingual need to face. And I think there are a million benefits to being bilingual. It shows that children think about things in different ways. And, it opens up the world because you know that there's different ways of looking at the world and saying things. But I do also think that if you're bilingual and trilingual, you will never have the same linguistic stability, if you will, of a monolingual, because whenever I'm speaking live, and I mean, I just want to point out my Danish was never fluent, but it was still a part of my formation, right? So there's some things I think in Danish, and then everything else is jumbled up between Italian and English. Like, I'm not sure that I divide, people go, what language do you think in? I'm like, well, I'm not sure it's that divided. I think it kind of mixes together. And sometimes the perfect word will come up in Italian, usually when I'm speaking in English, or
Yeah.
vice versa. So, I do think that for all of us who work and live in more than one language, there are disadvantages to being bilingual sometimes. They are tiny, but they are. And I think when you're speaking publicly, sometimes I envy my monolingual friends because I'm like, God, it must be so clear when everything that you're thinking is in the one language that then you're going to use to communicate. So being bilingual is a lot better. It's like it's such an advantage when I'm writing, because I also write books, mainly sort of nonfiction, and articles. Because when I'm writing, I can use the concept I'm getting in another language and adapt it. But when you're speaking live, you're speaking like
Yeah.
this, right? You don't have the time. And so one of the things that I do, for example, when I prepare for programs, I do a lot of mouth exercises,
Mm-hmm.
but I also try to switch off the other language. So if I'm about to do Italian television, and now with Skype, I can do Italian television from my kitchen in London, I would try not to read or talk in English for at least 10 minutes before, if not more, 15 minutes. I will try to deactivate the English language side of my brain to benefit the Italian side. And I'll do it the other way around as well. If I'm
Yeah.
about to present a program, then I will try to switch off the Italian side before. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. I get you. Yeah. There are like nuances between like, are we talking about first language, mother tongue, native language? You mentioned dominant language, which I think it's a brilliant way to really differentiate. Another word that I would say like your adopted language. What happens with me is that for a lot of things, for a lot of topics, I am just so much more better equipped. I'm so much better equipped to talk about something in English than in Spanish. Like, I don't talk about learning English or like different personal development things in Spanish as much as I do in English. And so I'm just so much more familiar with the vocabulary set in English than in Spanish. If I had to do it in Spanish, I could kind of do it, but I would, finding myself having to translate from English to my native language, Spanish. Whereas, like for a lot of things, I don't live in an English speaking country, so there are many like mundane things that I cannot say in English, even if they're like very basic things.
I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
any kitchen things in English. Like the kitchen I kind of learned them over the years. I'm also a terrible cook, but because at home we
Yeah.
always spoke Italian, I had no idea what a lot of kitchen utensils were in English
Yeah.
because, of course, my mom never said them in English. So,
Yeah.
I totally agree. I mean, it sounds like in your case, it's almost like English is your professional language. So when you talk about the issue that you do for work, it's your dominant language in that field. And that makes perfect sense.
And yeah, it's kind of bizarre that you're gonna find yourself and the audience as well sometimes having to translate from English into your native language when you decide to talk about something in your native language, something that you usually discuss in English. So it's funny, it's interesting, but to your point, that happens when you are bilingual, when you know more than one language. It's privilege, and any privilege comes with its drawbacks.
I think so. I think there's just some obstacles, and I think it's the being aware of them. And I think what always annoys me is how, there's a lot of discussion around diversity, and don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
absolutely correct diversity, but diversity itself means a lot of things, but it's often centered around ethnicity or religion or sexual orientation or things like that. And rarely does it include the issue of language, because believe you me, I mean, I write a newsletter called News with a Foreign Accent. I made it very clear what it was. And one of the inspirations was that I would get a lot of young journalists who, of course, would see me on TV and write to me because they could see I wasn't a native English speaker. And so they wanted advice, second language English speakers. And one of the things that spurred me to write the newsletter was that I got tired of lying to them, because the truth was, how good is your English? Can you almost pass as a native speaker? Because no one was being honest with them that this was going to hold them back, and not necessarily hold them back because, you can make it through, but it was going to be an issue, right? And a lot of bosses weren't saying that it was going to be an issue. And it was, upsetting to me because there's a lot of very, enthusiastic journalists, young journalists that with a lot to give, and very often with experiences from parts of the world that tend to be underreported. So, very important messages that they had. And yeah, and nothing. And I just want to just pick up on one thing that you said about, what is a native speaker? Because I cannot tell you the debates that I've had and like people getting quite upset with me as well. Oh, but native speaker, I've come up with a sort of formula. To me, you're a native speaker if you cannot remember learning English,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Because there's a lot of people, especially in multi-heritage households. So
Yeah.
my son, his father is English, British English, and I'm Italian. So my son always grew up with Italy and Italian at home. You could argue that because I'm the mother, that Italian was his mother tongue, or so he's like a second language, either Italian speaker or English speaker. But I don't agree with that. I think he almost has two native languages
Yeah, totally.
because he will never remember a time when he didn't speak any of them, and he never had to learn how to make the sounds. I remember learning how to make the sound, th, there, this, therefore, thorough, which I'm sure it's driven everybody crazy.
Yeah.
The th sound, right? Because it's such a distinctive English sound, right? Whether it's American, British, Australian. And so to me, after quite a few fights over this, even because people get very passionate, my definition is, can you remember learning English? If you can't remember learning English, then you kind of are a native speaker. You could still have an accent. You could still have a very strong non-native accent, but you are a native speaker.
It's a very pragmatic way to see it, definitely.
Well, I work with language. I couldn't afford to be all academic. I got fired several times because of sounding foreign. And also in TV, you're not just there with your friends and your colleagues going, oh, no, no, you sound great, you sound fine. That doesn't happen in TV. You've got the audience that will send emails or tweets or comments or whatever, and they will be brutally honest.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't afford to not be pragmatic.
I can't even begin to imagine what that pressure must feel like. Because sometimes I also find myself trying to, correct my language, my pronunciation, the way that I sound, and I already put some pressure on myself, but that doesn't even come close to comparing to what it must feel like in your situation in a professional setting where you're supposed to follow these rules and to speak within these constraints. And if you just go too much out of those, you might be fired.
I've changed a lot. And, I think it's both that my language has changed. And if I'm honest, I've become older and more experienced and maybe wiser. And,
Mm-hmm.
With the years that go, you look a little older, but you know yourself more. So that's a good thing. I think the advice that I would give is that ultimately never try to be something that you're not, you know? At the beginning, when I first started presenting on British TV, and this was a long time ago, this was 2003. So the country was very different, the UK was very different, television was very different, a
The
lot of things
world
were very.
was completely different. Yeah.
No, it was. It just, I mean, Al Jazeera English didn't exist. It hadn't
Mm-hmm.
launched when I started. And I mean, I was told in no uncertain terms that I had to sound more, easier on a British ear. And at the time, I wasn't really presenting, I was reporting. And so I was sent for voice training, and the aim was to make me sound more British. I was never going to sound like an English rose, but I was told that I had to sound more British. Now, I think the buzzword here is clarity. So I think it's okay to be tough on yourself, and it's okay to berate yourself if you've made a mistake. Because even now on this podcast, what you're doing is that you're communicating, and you're communicating to people who, by definition, if they're listening to us, are second language English speakers. So they need us to be clearer even than native speakers would need to be, right? So I think clarity is everything. And the truth is that there are some non-English accents that do make it less clear. You know, the Spanish has the th sound, you know? Like I'm not even gonna, but it and Italian sometimes, well, Italian actually is clear, but it's very da 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 da. You know, a lot of accents will have something in them that may make the English less clear. And so now you still get criticisms, and I think it still upsets me sometimes because I think, oh, okay, whatever. But I know who I am. I know what I don't try to be. I don't sit there pretending to be British. I use my assets, you know, like in the UK, I am a first generation migrant, and actually, migration is a big story. And I like to think that, yes, okay, I don't sound like a native speaker, but I bring my experience and my understanding of what the UK is that someone who isn't a first generation migrant may not know. You know, I mean, I lived Brexit in a very particular way because I am a European citizen, right? But clarity is at the core of it. You know, you have to be clear, and people need to be able to understand you. And if that means speaking more slowly, if that means finding out what your particular problem, there you go, what your particular problems may be and working on them, then that's what you do. Clarity is non-negotiable.
Yeah, absolutely. The non-negotiable of clarity. Well, that's a very interesting topic as well. And, the idea of being your authentic self. It's a pretty complex and nuanced discussion, I would say.
I suppose what I mean is don't pretend to be something that you're not. So, am I the same when I read the news as I am sitting on the sofa playing with my son or, joking with friends? No. But when I go on TV, do I pretend to be something that I'm not? Basically, do I pretend to be British born and raised? No. I don't do that anymore. I be the TV professional version of me. Do you see the slight difference? Because we can't be our full authentic selves. We still need to integrate and adapt to the Anglophone world if we're using that language, but without pretending to be American or pretending to be British or pretending to be Australian.
Pretending to be another nationality, that's way too much for sure. But there is this tension, and it's not like we don't agree here. Pursuing another language, a lot of people that succeed at that, at achieving higher levels of fluency, they're just more okay with sounding in a new way. But of course, we don't want to pretend like all of a sudden we are American, we're Canadians, we are British. That just doesn't sound right, right? But there's this thing of like self-image, and the fact that you want to speak another language, it's like it shows that you're open to well, sounding in a new way. And a lot of times that just changes you, and you just continue being authentic, but in a way that you're ongoing, like in an ongoing way, you're constantly redefining or reestablishing your own authenticity. And the question of accent, which just carries such a strong baggage, a strong, like, oh, it's like how you identify yourself with the place that you come from. And, it's a lot of times a conscious decision to say, okay, I'm going to keep my accent. Or the problem here is in the word accent, I think, a lot of times, because if you just see it in a like use different semantics, like, I'm just comfortable with sounding in a new way or in a different way. And that's when you kind of like open yourself up to being a bit more, absorb more of like the different, the way that English in a certain place sounds, without trying to fool anyone, especially yourself, that, okay, you are from that place, you're American, you're British, right?
Look, I think accents matter. Also, there is a correct way of pronouncing certain words, right? There just is. So, um, and you need to emulate that. I suppose what I've noticed once now that I've started dipping my toe in the world of English as a
Yeah.
second language now that I've started sort of working on this topic, which has brought me to this podcast. I just see a lot of courses which it says, you can have a British accent in 6 months. Just think, first of all, I'm sorry to be the one to be the bearer of bad news. No, you can't. No, you can't. In my whole life, I have maybe met like two people that I can think of who learned English or came to the UK when they were adults, right? So, I mean, maybe not 50, but they were like 20, and who genuinely sound British, right? Two people out of whatever. And also, if you're doing anything where you're speaking publicly, it takes a lot of energy to put on a voice, So I think you need to find your real, authentic voice in English, which is probably going to have a lot of elements of your native language, especially if you have like a dominant native language, right? I don't know, let's say you're a Spanish speaker, English is the second language but you learned it later in life, right? So where you have one dominant native language and then you have English. And I think that's really important. I'll give you an example because I think sometimes it can get a bit theoretical. We talked a little bit earlier about the rrr, right? So there's three ways I can pronounce my name. One is Barbara Serra. One is Barbara Serra. And the other one is Barbara Serra. Now, the first one, Barbara Serra, Italian, as if there was any mistake. Barbara Serra has the rolled R that Americans use, that the Irish use, that the Scottish people use, that actually the West Country of England, so the West of England uses as well. Slightly different, but it's still. Barbara is the way that you would say in sort of posh English, British English, what we think of as the Queen's or King's English, right? Because they
RP.
flatten the R. Yeah, yeah. It's like I'm driving in my car. I'm driving in my car. Saying car instead of car is the one thing that separates me straight away. Any Brit knows in that instant, even if it's just that letter, that I'm not a native Brit. And I tried to say car. And it just took up so much of my energy that at one point I thought, why? Why? And so that's what I mean about you have to find a compromise, right? There are correct ways of pronouncing things, and some things will sound unnatural for a while if you're learning English. But something like the R, and just for the language nerds, it's called the retroflexive R or the rhotic
Yeah,
R.
brother.
And it's a difference, it's the R sound.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who's English, for anyone who's, an Arabic speaker, for anyone who has it in their native language, to go from that to the very British R, which basically doesn't exist, is very difficult, right? And so my personal compromise with my linguistic background was that I thought, you know what? The R stays. And so in English, I would never go on the news and say, good evening, you're watching Sky News, I'm Barbara Serra. I'd never say that. But I do say, you're watching Sky News. Good evening. I'm Barbara Serra. And it's Barbara, rah, rah, rah.
Unless your kind of like selling point was I sound so Italian or I sound so, because I can think of some like Hollywood actors who pretty much their whole selling point is that they sound from, I don't know, Colombia, they sound from a different place, but that is what makes them attractive, I guess, to the audience. It's a whole different game or a situation when it's like kind of like in a professional setting in BBC
Well,
or in journalism.
Sofia
Yeah.
Vergara is like the patron saint of all of us second language English speakers. There's that amazing meme of her. I get sent to this meme at least 3 times a
Oh, there's so many.
No, but well, because she's also like incredibly beautiful, funny, and sexy and everything. But where she says, "Do you even know how smart I am in Spanish?" You know that meme, and it's so true. Now, it's interesting though. Antonio Banderas is another one that I can think of. Um, but actually, I think acting is different because you can
Hmm.
adapt if you're especially in film, if you're recorded, you can record it 20 times until you got it right. So, and is there an element of stereotyping as well? I don't know, but yes, I mean, it does become part of, but because it is part of who you are, you know?
Yeah,
I think
ultimately.
sometimes, yeah, I think increasingly, even compared to 20 years ago, I think that is changing, where you would have, I don't know, a very famous actor or actress, let's say from the Spanish speaking world, who would have a part in a Hollywood film where it's not necessarily because they are from there. They wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't be part of their character. It would just be a thing, not a key element. But yeah, look, it's a thing because voices, more than anything, tell us what a person is. An
Mhm.
accent will tell you more about a person than almost anything else.
Quick pause here on the podcast. As you may have noticed, Barbara uses many advanced words. Good news is I've put together a resource that you can download, and it has the definitions of all the advanced words used in this episode. So if you want to express yourself effectively and in a more sophisticated way, just like Barbara does, what better way than to become familiar with the vocabulary that she uses? This is a PDF that also comes with the key insights, the biggest ideas that Barbara and I discussed in this episode of the podcast. I'll leave a link to that in the description below, so download it. And yeah, let's get back to the conversation. So, Barbara, you help second language English journalists overcome their linguistic and cultural barriers of not being from the Anglophone world. What are some of the specific challenges that second language English journalists face when their main focus is speaking publicly, and how do you help them address these issues?
I think, first of all, what I try to do is to acknowledge that there are barriers and acknowledge that there are difficulties. And it always amazes me how very few people, and by that I mean native English speakers, even see that. And so I acknowledge two things: that there's no such thing as international journalism. It's English language journalism. If you were to think of, okay, which ones are the biggest international outlets, broadcasters, newspapers, well, you'd think of the BBC, you would think of CNN, you would think of Reuters and the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Economist, the Financial Times. What do they all have in common? They're in English. What else do they all have in common? They're British and American, right? And I think that has an impact. And I know a lot of them will have their international sections, but bottom line is the editorial pyramid at the top will have bosses who, I mean, even if they're not British or American, are looking to that market because those publications are from those countries. So I think it's acknowledging those things and also acknowledging that if you're a journalist, language is your tool. I mean,
Yeah.
communication is everything. Literally, if you can't do that, I don't know, you're not doing anything. Broadcasting, and especially live broadcasting, may have particular challenges, but so does writing. And actually, if you work for an agency like Reuters or AP, the Associated Press, you need to write like that. I mean, literally, your job depends on writing concisely, quickly, and correctly. Yes, the stuff gets edited a little at base, but you can't rely on that too much. It needs, I mean, by and large, it has to come correct from you. So I suppose the first thing I do um, is to just have a chat with people. And so, it always amazes me, like someone quite young, and when you get more my age, you become like a matriarch, because you remember what it was like when you were younger. And I remember that when I was younger, there was one CNN presenter, Relitsa Vasileva. She had she is from Eastern Europe, and she sounded non-British, non-native English. But apart from that, there was no one. So I never had anyone to speak to.
Okay.
And so when a lot of young journalists come to me and ask for advice, I mean, I suppose the first thing I tell them is you're not mad, you're not crazy. It really is an obstacle. And in a way, a lot of the bosses that may be saying, oh no, don't worry, you sound fine. Often they're saying it to you because they don't really know how to solve it, you
Yeah.
know? And sometimes it can't be solved, depending on your level of English. It may be that certain jobs aren't for you, you know? I mean, I am a lot more comfortable being a correspondent or a reporter or even a presenter when I'm working on something specific than doing general news
Okay.
on a British channel, because there I feel I'm not playing to all my strengths and there's a
Hmm.
few weaknesses, although, like I mentioned, the whole migrant thing is in itself a strength across the board.
Yeah.
So, what are the things I tell them? I tell them, first of all, differentiate between accent and language, because it is easy to fixate on accent, right? And think it's because I sound like this and I sound like that. But actually, the question is, above all else, how strong is your language? I mean, really, not just the grammar, which I'm sorry, there's no excuse for it not to be perfect if you want to work in journalism. Not just good enough, perfect, you know? Although I say that there's plenty of native English and American journalists whose grammar is not perfect, but you know what I mean? We aim for that. But how rich is your vocabulary? How varied is it? You know? And so focus on language, try to broaden it as much as possible. Listen to all sorts of things. If you think that you have some blind spots, like I mentioned earlier, I don't know any cooking things in English because I learned them in Italian. Cooking is okay, but if there's other issues that actually you should know for work that you don't know in English, learn them. I mean, literally, go on Google. I have lists, in my diary, I mean, now I know it, but when I first started talking about international politics on Italian TV, I had to write down what the word in Italian was for the West Bank, the Palestinian territories, with Israel. It's called the West Bank. In Italian, it's called something completely different. It's called Cisgiordania, you know? So a lot of the technical terms you learn. So focus on language and then look to accent. And with accents, you have to be brutally honest. You have to record yourself. You need to listen back. You need to get friends to listen back and say, okay, how do I sound? What is it that is, if it is unclear, there will always be a few things, there'll always be a few letters, there'll always be a few, all of us will have these idiosyncrasies in our speech. And then, within reason, try to resolve them. And your aim has to be clarity. So that is
Yeah.
some of the advice that I give. And then, so that's the practical stuff. And then we get into a whole other discussion, which is about culture. Language is culture.
Hmm.
If I have the cultural background of being, I mean, I've also lived in the UK a long time, but of being an Italian. So, for example, there's a lot of discussions around fascism right now, or the rise of the far right. I have very different discussions on it in Italy than I do in England, because Italy has a history of fascism, England doesn't. And so the breadth of knowledge of Italians will be bigger than what most English people understand by fascism, because it's not in their history. It's not in their lived experience of, not that many generations ago. Now, that's an extreme case, but wherever you speak in English, you're not just speaking a language, you're speaking a culture. And when all of us speak English, we are in some ways taking on the culture of the Anglophone world. And I think we need to be aware of that when we do it. And also sometimes be aware that bringing up elements of our own culture can be an asset and certainly can create a more diverse workplace.
So we're already starting with a pretty high bar as far as your language skills. Yeah, for you to even consider this, working in an English speaking country as a journalist, all the questions around language and the skill gaps must be, for the most part, closed. And then there's this other part about culture. How would you, or what would you suggest if I'm someone who has all the language skills already polished? I am pretty fluent and proficient in the language, so that is not a big issue. But I'm not yet so familiarized with the culture aspect, with me speaking English, but also speaking the culture. If I'm yet a little bit behind as far as being completely up to date or
Yeah.
understand the situation, the cultural background.
Yeah.
How could I get caught up, if that's even the right
By,
word,
by
right?
living there, by living there. But I think also you also have to, within the Anglophone world, of course, there's a big difference between the UK and the US, for example, right?
Absolutely.
And bizarrely, Americans and Brits will often have like little cultural misunderstandings. And it's not just about phrases that they use, it's just different mannerisms. People are different, right? That's the beauty. So I think that is something that will come with time. I look at that very much from a journalistic point of view. And so the thing that I always remind people is, it depends where you're working. Are you working for an international channel or are you working for a domestic news channel? If you're working for a British news channel aimed at a British audience, well, then I hate to tell you, but you need to absolutely try to understand as much as you humanly can that audience, because that's the audience that you're catering to, right? If you're working for an international channel, say Al Jazeera English, then it's slightly different because you're kind of aiming it at the whole world. But I still think that the Anglophone world is almost like the managerial culture of the world, that it's still like the fallback setting, the standardized the setting of a lot of jobs. And, I have an online course. It's not just journalists. It's a lot of people that will work in finance, in academia, in PR, in the entertainment industry, because the Anglophone culture will dominate. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. It just depends what you're adapting it to. And ultimately, I think what's important is the awareness of it.
So I guess proximity to the place, right? Being there so that you're in an optimal position to really absorb all those things. And the element of time. Yeah.
But when you're speaking, who are you speaking to? When you're speaking in English, because when you speak in English, your potential audience is 1.5 billion people. Of that 1.5 billion people, who are you speaking to? Is it native speakers? Is it second language? Where and where are they from? And I think that is a problem that only really arises with English. If I'm speaking in Italian, you know what? By and large, there's 60 million people in the world who speak Italian, and they tend to live in Italy. So it's much narrower.
Hmm.
Kind of know. I'm speaking in English, if I'm on Al Jazeera or Sky or doing something for an American podcast or speaking to you, totally different audiences, You don't get that. I mean, Spanish, I say that. I mean, Spanish is another language that you could speak to a lot of. But if you think about it, it's still South America and Spain, it's not Asia, right?
Yeah.
Whereas English could be spoken in Hong Kong, right? So that would be my point.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Love it. Barbara, where can people find you? I think a lot of people are going to be interested in following you, learning more about you, reading your stuff and watching you. So where can people find you if they want to get a hold of you? Where can people, yeah, get in contact if they want to talk to you?
So there's two ways. For the language stuff, I have created a course, but it's not just a course, it's also a mailing list where I try to get people involved. And it's barbaraserra.info. And if you look at that page, you can also go to the course, but I write a lot about what I think is the important stuff around this issue. Then I have a newsletter on Substack, News with a Foreign Accent, where I
Mhm.
also talk more about, international politics or stuff like that. But there are quite a few articles where I focus specifically on language. And then I'm very bad on Instagram, but always tell myself I should publish more. But yeah, that's kind of Instagram, LinkedIn, that kind of stuff. And for the Italians, Facebook. And most of them have the tick. But really, barbaraserra.info. If you go there, I've got a downloadable free, 8 pitfalls, like just a list of advice, and that's totally free. You can just download it when you go to the website, and that's kind of what I'm building around this issue.
Amazing. Very nice. So I'll be leaving all those links in the description of the podcast. So English Hero, check those links out and yeah, follow Barbara. Now, wrapping up, Barbara, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I want to wrap up the conversation with this idea that questions lead, answers follow. So if we want better answers, we need to ask better questions. Barbara, what would then be a question that you like to leave our audience with today?
Okay, so I think, I've been talking a lot about how the Anglophone world dominates because English is the sort of dominant global language. So I think to all of us who are second language English, I think an interesting point is, okay, what can you, as a second language English speaker, culturally bring to the Anglophone world that is from your culture? So to give you an example, I think the fact that I come from Italy, which has an obvious history of fascism because it's a country that kind of created the word, if nothing else, and Mussolini was the first, one to call it fascism as such. So I try to bring that to the Anglophone world. I try to write about that. I try to focus on that more. And so I think the question for a lot of us would be, okay, well, what can you bring from your culture that you think would be useful to the Anglophone world? So it's not just what we can take from, but also because I think that is key to true diversity. And I think that is key to a truly global, interconnected conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. Think about that. What can you bring that's from your culture to your when you're speaking English and when you're interacting with the wider English speaking world? That is absolutely amazing. Thank you, Barbara, for sharing that. Thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. See you soon. Arrivederci.
And there you go, English Hero. That wraps up another episode of the podcast. I hope that you enjoyed my chat with Barbara Serra. Definitely, there are many lessons that you can take from this conversation and what it would take for you to succeed as a non-native English speaker if you find yourself in a native English speaking environment. A lot of times it's about embracing your uniqueness as a non-native English speaker instead of just trying to blend with native English speakers and just trying to copy their accent, while there is an element of you trying to improve your accent or make it more like the accent of the place where you're living. There's also an element of retaining some of your uniqueness, and I think Barbara is a great example of that. She mentioned the difficulties with articulating that R sound, the rhotic R sound, that, myself as someone who follows the American English accent, if I was to imitate the British English accent, that R, like in ka, would be kind of strange to my way of articulating English. And I totally get where she's coming from with pretty much resigning and saying, okay, I'm going to keep the R. That's just the way I want to articulate this sound. Otherwise, it's just too hard for me. I don't really feel like having to always be mindful of that R doesn't have to sound. And I really like that unapologetic attitude about her decision to keep that R, or whatever, in your case, the particular sound is. Whatever you decide to keep and not change and not really adapt to the target language, if you do it and if you really own that decision, that is great and is very respectable that you do that. So anyway, that's my view on this part of the discussion that myself and Barbara had. Perhaps I'm going to expand on that. And also, to sum it all up, one of Barbara's main points in her message is that clarity in communication is more important than a perfect accent. And it makes a lot of sense that she'd say that, especially with her background in journalism and her vocation for communication. If you want to revisit the points that we've discussed and or want to learn the vocabulary that Barbara and myself use in this episode, remember, I've put together a free PDF guide that comes with this episode, and you can download that below in the description of the podcast. Thank you again for tuning in and being a part of our heroic English community. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe and like the video if you are watching it on YouTube. And if you are listening to this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the streaming services out there for podcasts, I'm sure there's going to be an option to leave a 5-star review there. So please go ahead and do that. That helps immensely. Thank you for doing that. So, English Hero, keep learning, keep growing, keep living your English, and until next time.